Welcome back into Uncrewed Views. I'm now joined by our guest for this week's episode. We have David Cole, who is the co-founder and CEO of FlyFreely. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
G'day, Matt. Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Absolutely, and as you can tell by his voice, David is Australian. We have quite the time difference here, coming from the East Coast in the US and connecting with Australia. But really happy to have David and his perspective on, specifically in this podcast, we're going to talk about BVLOS and Part 108, and he's going to draw on some of his experience working in the US with customers in the US, but then also in Australia, New Zealand, other parts of the world, and kind of how that can inform some of what we have coming ahead in the US. But before we kind of dive into all that, David, do you mind just kind of giving an introduction to yourself and then also FlyFreely?
Yeah, certainly. So I started in the drone industry back in 2013 in Australia, obviously, and we started as a drone service provider. So bringing in the technology and really applying it into the mining, energy, construction sectors here in Australia. In that journey, we had the challenge of managing and scaling our own operations. So dealing with all the compliance issues, maintenance issues, people management, mission management. And there was nothing really around at the time. So we went and built our own software platform to do that. And now we're fully focused on that. We've been fully focused on that since around 2018. And prior to all of that, I was a mechanical engineer working again in the mining, oil and gas, construction sectors as well. So got a pretty diverse sort of background and a fair bit of experience in the UAS sector.
And so as we kind of get into the main portion of the conversation, thinking about Part 108, obviously as we're talking here in the middle of June, we're still waiting for the final rule to come across,
Yep.
So we can really only base things off of the NPRM that came out towards the end of last summer, almost a year ago now. I'm curious, from your customers in the US, maybe other people around the world are talking about this too, but what are you hearing either positively or negatively about this proposed Part 108 rule? And I wonder if there are any key differences in those opinions based on the sectors that these people might be working in.
Yes, absolutely. Definitely seeing a clear trend between sort of two camps. So one camp is bring it on. I want to be ready. As soon as that starter's gun fires, I want to be ready, set, go. And that tends to be more the industrial users who really want to leverage BVLOS for, they're kind of constrained at the moment, so they really want to leverage it as much as they possibly can. So they're quite excited. Then you have another camp, which is essentially quite happy under Part 107. They don't really, BVLOS might help a bit in certain circumstances, but generally they're pretty happy with the way they're operating. So, and all this change kind of scares them a bit. And so it tends to be more in the sort of government sectors, sort of seeing some of those sort of trends. But yeah, definitely sort of two camps coming out for sure.
And I mean, speaking of, that lines up a lot with what I've heard. I think, the folks that are operating under 107 right now, largely under 107, there is some concern just about what kind of happens to them. And again, we still don't know. I anticipate that the final Part 108 rule will hopefully address that more than the NPRM did, which was basically not at all. But if you're talking to an organization that is working under 107, has a functioning 107 program, what are going to be some of the first areas of concern or areas that they need to pay attention to after this Part 108 rule does come out?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And so based on what we've seen in the past and our experience is BVLOS is actually a pretty significant step up, both in terms of all the systems you're going to need in place, all the record keeping, reporting, etc., etc. And generally, organizations with large amounts of people and fleets really are very nervous about that sort of transition. And honestly, what tends to happen is you have these sort of specialists within the organization that become really, are really into the detail, the aviation side of things, and become sort of experts in that BVLOS. And then you have everyone else is kind of like, do I really need it? No, well then I'm going to just stick to what I know and what works for me. So it's really those two things, because then you have to do a whole bunch more training for anyone who wants to be under Part 108. The other consideration you have is what happens with your fleet. So under Part 108, there's going to be, sort of strict maintenance schedules that have to be adhered to. So then you can't really then go and use that aircraft in a Part 107 operation if those Part 107 people aren't doing all the pre-starts and maintenance that a Part 108 would require. So you kind of end up almost with split fleets and split kind of operations, as we call it. That's kind of the term that sort of emerges. And what tends to naturally happen is you get these sort of two groups doing slightly different things in the organization.
I alluded to this at the top, that you have some experience kind of in other markets, specifically Australia and
Yep.
New Zealand. Can you talk a little bit about how Australia has kind of gone through their own BVLOS rule evolution, and was there anything that organizations did in Australia that organizations in the US might be able to learn from?
Yeah, so I think the big trend we saw is, again, these rules come out. And so just for context, Australia introduced BVLOS back in 2018 under the SORA framework, so the Specific Operation Risk Assessment Framework. So again, we've had it for a few years now. And I guess one of the things that was when everyone was getting into it is they were essentially going too complicated too quickly, right? So I got this new rule, so I want to fly big things in a city, right? And so putting in their application and going, okay, you beauty, I can now do all this stuff. And then it just gets stuck in regulatory sort of gridlock because the regulator doesn't know how to deal with it. You as an organization aren't sophisticated enough and mature enough to actually probably operate at that sort of level. So it ends up just dying or going nowhere. So we saw that again and again and again. And so the strategies that really worked, and what the regulator now kind of forces on people, essentially, without saying they force it, they indirectly force it. They force you to start out remote, right? So where there's no, the ground risk is low, the air risk is low, you kind of start out there, prove your bona fides, and then, progressively get more and more complex over time. So that's definitely what we've seen, and I suspect a similar thing will play out in the US, where you probably don't want to start with the most complicated use case possible. You probably want to start with something reasonably easy and straightforward, just if nothing else, just to get through that regulatory approval process as fast as possible. Otherwise, you get stuck in regulatory purgatory, and then you can't do anything for a while. So that's one of probably the key lessons I think we've seen and observed.
It's an interesting path that you kind of describe in starting more remote, and then kind of moving into the more complex use cases. Can you talk a little bit more, just for my own curiosity, and how you say the regulators kind of forced it without forcing it? Like, can you kind of talk about how that happened, and is that something that the FAA would be able to replicate? Obviously, two different cultures, two different geographies.
Yeah, and I guess the caveat on all of this is we really just don't know how the FAA is going to process these applications, how much they're going to scrutinize them versus just sort of rubber stamp whatever comes in front of them. I got no idea. And there's an assumption here that they will be quite critical on the initial applications and thoroughly look at them. So typically what the regulator here will do is, they'll basically say, demonstrate to me how you're going to, say you want to fly in controlled airspace, very complex airspace, they'll basically say, okay, prove to me you can, separate yourself and do all these pre-flight things, post-flight things. And that's where most people go, well, I don't even know where to start, right? So they're like, okay, well, if you don't know where to start, how about you start out here and, where there's no one really flying, and yes, then yes, we agree you can, do some simple things out there. And then people, you start to learn really quickly about what works, what doesn't. And then you can take those sort of lessons, into more complex applications from there. So that's sort of typically how it sort of plays out.
And maybe this is kind of a similar answer or pulling on the same thread, but again, looking at the NPRM and thinking about how this final rule might end up, what recommendation or recommendations would you have for the FAA about how to improve this rule and make sure that it does function well for the industry?
Yeah, so one of the traps we kind of got ourselves into, and honestly, every country's pretty much got themselves into the same trap. And I think it's just when you start out, you just got to start somewhere. It's the operational area approval. So as the NPRM is written now, when you apply, you basically have to say, I'm going to be in this area, and you submit that to the FAA, and the FAA goes, great, sign you off you go. Now, the problem comes when you want to go to a new area. Do you have to reapply again? What's that process going to look like? And what ends up happening is it just puts so much burden on the regulator, everything just gets backlogged because they're just trying to deal with all these variations coming in. So what our regulator CASA here did to their credit is they actually came up with the concept of a broad area approval. Now, what that basically says is the regulator approves someone inside the organization to do those area approvals, right? So they're basically delegating some of that responsibility back to someone in the organization. Now, that person is now on the hook, right? So if you say it's all good to fly here and, they audit you and it's not all good, then, I don't want to be in your shoes. But what it enables now is an industry to move forward much, much faster. So this is particularly where this has become particularly apparent is in a lot of drone in a box applications. So, it was taking forever. You get one drone in a box, you want to move it, wait 6 months for your next approval to come through, right? So it's been a bit of a game changer for the industry here, and that would be my recommendation over time is to have some sort of mechanism that would allow the operators to essentially self-certify new operating areas going forward.
Yeah, I think if you talk to anybody in the U.S., both with the FAA and anything to avoid that backlog in the FAA, it's going to go a long way.
Exactly. And sorry, honestly, the other point I'd sort of make on this is the other sort of game changer in our industry was the standardization of operations manuals. So as it currently stands in the NPRM, there's some headings that you got to cover in your operations manual, which is great. But what tends to happen is on day one, you're going to have 100 to 1,000 different companies submit manuals that are all different, right? So then the FAA has got to go through each of those into bespoke manuals and see whether, has someone slipped in something, they shouldn't have, is it to the highest standard? And it creates huge amounts of issues. We basically solve that. The regulator essentially publishes a template, and on your initial application anyway, you follow that word for word, right? So everyone starts the same, and it gives you the baseline, and then from there you can, vary and do whatever you want afterwards. But it just helps people get started. And honestly, most people, like I would say 90% of operators, are not really doing any bespoke operations manuals. They just want, what works, what allows me to get going, and tell me what to do, right? And I'll do it. And then you have the other sort of bespoke operators who want to do interesting and unique things, and that's fine. They can go tweak it and vary it from there. So I tell all regulators the same thing, on that side of things, because yes, the paperwork burden is non-trivial. once you unlock this, you'll get swamped. So yeah, that would be the other piece of advice.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I hadn't really thought a ton about it, but especially in an industry like this where everybody's kind of in different verticals and doing different kinds of work. So I can see how everybody's kind of submitting different applications, and that just becomes cumbersome very, very quickly. Yeah,
it just becomes overwhelming. And for no real, safety or operational benefit, really.
Thinking about back to the operator side of things and going back to what we were talking about before with, Part 107 versus Part 108 users and people that are doing kind of simple workflows and complex workflows that are now operating under the same sort of regulatory web. Have you seen any specific kind of work workflow solutions that have emerged that have been able to bridge that gap that might be able to be applied to the US?
Yeah. Without blowing our trumpet too much. This is kind of one of the problems we obviously hit, right? So we built the platform to deal with that. So you can actually build out different workflows for different types of operations. So everything from your standard 107 operation, you can add in 107 waivers and build new workflows out of that. And then you could build out multiple permits, which we haven't really talked about, but Part 108 is going to have essentially a permitting system and a certificate system where you could possibly have combinations of both. It's going to be pretty interesting how that plays out based on what sort of operations you're doing. But yes, it tends to get quite complex. And then each of those have different requirements for the pilot and the aircraft, and then any forms and checklists, and then any maintenance you need to do. So you end up with this kind of web of sort of operations and workflows that you kind of need to manage. And yes, so that's one of the things we sort of build into our platform. And then we allow you to do that in multiple different jurisdictions. So combining in the different regulatory rules for different countries as well.
And thinking about your experience in Australia, obviously it's not a perfect one-to-one map, but having seen Australia kind of have some BVLOS flights for quite some time at this point, especially relative to the US, do you see the divide between what 107 operators and 108 operators are doing, both workflow-wise and regulatory-wise? Do you see that shrinking over time, or is this sort of, especially for an organization that might be operating under both waivers, is this sort of a long term? They're always going to have to be thinking about this divide and how planning around how different they are.
Yeah, typically there's a divide, and it actually comes back to the actual people involved. So what's tending to happen is you have non-aviation specialists operating drones now, right? So drones is the second or third thing they do in their role. They tend to not be aviation experts. They're not going to know about safety management systems and, complex airspace rules and stuff like that. So they'll typically just want to stick to the, what's the minimum I can get away with? What's the basics that I need? And that tends to be like a 107, maybe some waivers. Then you'll have sort of the specialists in the organization, which are kind of really across all the aviation detail. They kind of thrive on that sort of stuff, and they tend to become your sort of 108, also beyond line of sight sort of experts that can do that. Now, we've also seen other interesting things happen. So if you don't have those kind of 108 sort of specialists in your organization, you can always outsource it. Another model we've seen sort of emerge is a company will get the 108 certificate and then allow other companies, people, and drones to operate under that certificate, right? So they kind of become they're dealing with all the regulatory oversight, but allowing the actual people in the organization to go and do what they need to do. So and then we've also seen different models where, so 108 will introduce the concept of an operation supervisor. So they're the person who's ultimately responsible for everything under Part 108. So the fall guy, right? So that they are answerable to the FAA for everything that goes on. And we've also seen a trend where companies are like, we're not comfortable there. We don't really understand that. So we want actually a third party, and they'll contract in a third party to act in that role, as kind of the expert who can oversee everything. So it's all about what's the organization's kind of sort of risk appetite and sort of internal competencies with aviation activities that different models can emerge. So, all I'd say to people is, yes, there'll actually surprisingly be a few different options on the table. It's kind of not an either or, and you can kind of mix and match to find what works for you.
And again, with the obvious caveat that we're really just looking at the NPRM and maybe some educated guesses on what changes might come through. But looking at how markets like Australia, other markets around the world have evolved under these regulations, are there any potential effects that organizations might have to reckon with that you think maybe are being a little overlooked right now or not discussed enough in the U.S. market?
So yeah, there's a few, I guess, technical side of things is what's going to happen with the airworthiness side of Part 108. That's kind of a big unknown. I'm no expert in that area, but it's really, I think that the question mark there is what's going to happen to your existing fleet? Is it going to be capable of being approved under Part 108? How long is that going to take? So that there's a whole bunch of questions there, which I really don't know the answer to. 'Cause I'm not sure the process has been fully clear yet. So that's kind of one aspect. The non-technical aspects are kind of coming back to what I said before about what's your internal capacity here on that operations supervisor. So we've seen that role. That role is critical, right? So if no one's filling that role, technically your organization couldn't operate. Okay, so so that brings some really interesting dynamics, right? Because that operations supervisor now has a fair bit of power, right? So we've seen everything from, what happens when they get sick, what happens if they want to go on vacation, all the way through to increase my pay, otherwise I'm leaving, and leaving you high and dry, right? So how you build in redundancy there and what the FAA will allow in terms of redundancy there is going to be an interesting question. So, for example, one of the ways that's been solved here is you essentially can have deputies or deputies to that sort of role, and they can be delegated responsibilities. So essentially, you're not fully reliant on that person to do everything. There's some sort of delegation capability built into the system. So I think there are probably two aspects, and then the other ones are really on the reporting and record keeping. If you look at in detail, the reporting requirements are pretty significant. So that's basically notifying the FAA of everything from literally all your flight history every month has to be sent to the FAA. Any sort of incidents have to be reported within, I think, 72 hours, like communications issues, like security issues, like the whole thing. It's actually pretty significant. And then on the record keeping is very similar. So you really start having to get into, component level maintenance, tracking, obviously individual flights, times, all the training records. So training is another big aspect on all of this, and becomes a key sort of question. And I think the other thing organizations will need to grapple with is what do they do with training? So you really got two options there. You could build out your own in-house sort of training program, or do you basically outsource that to a sort of competent third party to deliver that? Again, we've seen mixtures of that model as well. You have both camps sort of emerging, and then there's sort of hybrid where some of the training companies will basically allow internal trainers to train with their content and things like this. So again, we see sort of different models potentially emerging in the training sector as well. So I think there are a couple of the elements that you'd have to start thinking about now and planning for what's your sort of rollout strategy when Part 108 comes along.
Well, David, I really appreciate your perspective on all of this. We've covered a lot of ground here. Before we go, I just want to, we've talked a little bit about what FlyFreely is doing for customers. Do you want to just talk a little bit more about what you all are doing, especially for these folks that are going to be going through this transition, and how they might be able to learn a little bit more and maybe get in touch with you folks?
Yeah, so we're publishing, several documents. So the current document we've got is our sort of preparation guide, which is essentially covering a whole bunch of the topics we've spoken about and going into a lot more detail onto, what does the NPR, really mean in practice? That's the question. And obviously building out a whole bunch of capability in the platform to essentially enable that sort of stage transition. If you want to go straight into 108, happy days. But and what we typically see is you have the sort of transition. We've built out a bunch of tools in the platform which allows you to do that. So just start with 107, get all your 107 operations in, add in 108, and then you can actually, add people and aircraft to those workflows as they become available, and you want to expand. So kind of creates a seamless transition for you. And again, we've had experience doing that in a whole bunch of countries. So yeah, we're quite across all of that. So yeah, if you want to find out more, flyfreely.io is the website. Feel free to contact us there if you want a demo, to find out more, or follow us on LinkedIn. And yeah, I think that's the places you can find us.
All right, David, well, again, really appreciate your perspective on this. And just as a shameful plug for our own show, David's also going to be speaking in September at Commercial UAV Expo, so looking forward to maybe there'll be a final Part 108 rule by that point. Who knows? Fingers crossed.
We hope so.
This is going to be a big conversation either way. But David, thank you again so much for taking the time today.
Not a problem. Thanks, Matt. See you later.